Hello, fellow fractals, and welcome back to my show, Fractal in Time, where we look at the intersection of science and spirituality and try to understand our place within the universe and the collective structure, and how by understanding both, you can empower yourself and better your life. Today, we're going to look at the nature of reality and how we relate to it. I want to take some time to analyze how what we call the electromagnetic spectrum is really a set of frequencies for how fast the electric charge or electron cycles through the center of whatever discrete object we're talking about. We call that the frequency because it's how many times it cycles through its center. To begin, all of the observable reality is classified within the electromagnetic spectrum, and this ranges from 0 to infinity. However, we've found that human vision can only see from a very narrow range of 440 to 770 terahertz. And according to NASA, this is 0.0035% of the observable universe. That's a ridiculous amount compared to what we have surrounding us. So if we see so little, what might be hidden from us? What might be affecting our everyday experience? If we look at the more exotic form of matter that we're just now starting to explore with science, called plasma, we begin to see that this exotic state of matter has some very, very interesting properties. First, plasma can exist in many different energy states, from a slower oscillating rate where it's barely vibrating within its environment, yet still distinct, all the way up to something like the sun, which is incredibly charged and vibrating very, very fast. Plasma has several distinct features that separate it from the other states of matter, such as solid, gas, liquid. Plasma is a highly ionized field of coherent ions, sustaining itself around a ultimate perimeter at the center of this plasma, or plasmoid. The way these plasmoids sustain themselves is actually sort of interesting because they have basically built into them the definition of consciousness, or being alive. I say this because the general shape of a torsion field is that it moves energy from its center, out of its center, to the outer perimeter, and then back around the outer perimeter underneath it, then spinning around the left side, and then till spiraling back in towards the top. This cyclical pattern that is recursive or self-repeating allows a torsion field to be formed. And a torsion field is a fancy way of saying that it creates a donut-shaped like geometry in which the shape oscillates between a perfect sphere, this donut, and then back into a sphere again. This general pattern and shape also explains how things become aware within their environment. Because as energy cycles around the perimeter, it's probing or interacting with all of the energy within and surrounding its own field. So it's probing the external environment. It's being affected by the external energy just by virtue of interacting with it. And then that change to the energy comes back towards the center where it's processed again, compressed, and then squeezed until only the most perfect or essential information is understood before the energy starts that pattern back around again, sustaining itself repeatedly. What it's compressing at the center is experience. And that experience is providing the torsion field shape a better frame of reference in which it can sustain itself and have a better grip on its environment. This process we call also consciousness, because what this torsion field is doing is it's contrasting itself to the environment. It's bringing it back in to consciously understand it, and then it's moving on with its beingness. What's fascinating is that if you extrapolate this and start to understand that these torsion fields can actually stack within each other and on top of each other and provide a symbiotic and beneficial shape that can sustain multiple things, you begin to see how life in the universe is this fractal shape. Because what happens at the center of a plasma who is able to sustain itself is that as these energy waves return to their center, reaching the outgoing wave at the center, there's a squeezing of the energy that gets pushed into the base level of reality, or what many call the longitudinal field or the scalar field of the electromagnetic field. This field is, in essence, the entire electromagnetic spectrum. However, because it is the base platform of it, it's incredibly hard to detect from within the environment. Imagine you were living in the ocean, and you were living in a castle at the bottom of the sea, and you were trying to figure out what is all of this. What do we live in? We have the ground here, but like, what is this water? We don't know what water is. All we know is that we breathe it, and it gives us resistance, and it allows us to live. So what is this stuff? You slowly figure out, oh, there's water wind, okay? This water wind is, it's got a current, okay? Where's these currents coming from? You would basically be blind at the bottom of the ocean, not having any idea how any of this is moving. Well, that's where we come in, because what if I tell you that the air doesn't really move that different compared to the ocean? Because it's all just electrical fields interacting with each other. And these fields oscillate in what we call waves. And when these waves or oscillations intersect in a way that they constructively add to each other, they add to the entire field and recharge it. These plasma structures are assumed to compose 99.9% of the universe. And some of their features include being able to oscillate energy at different frequencies and being able to contain different amounts of energy depending on what's going on with them and what they're interacting with. For an easy comparison, let's look at how the ocean moves. If we think about how the ocean crests on the seashore when the waves that are coming towards the shore hit the shore, they slide up on the shore before slowly sliding back into the ocean, while behind it, another wave is coming. If you look at the foam as it rides the incoming wave, it sort of sloshes on top, but doesn't really get impacted by these up and down waves. This is exactly how the electromagnetic field is proposed to work. And it's at these points where there is a translation of the vorticity back in towards the incoming wave, that it folds into what we recognize as transverse waves or the up and down waves. Now, if you look at this from a more holistic perspective, as the ocean is an entire body of water, you realize that the entire ocean is consisting of mostly these longitudinal waves, and it's just disturbance that's causing the waves on the top to move. This is demonstrated by how when there's a tsunami, an earthquake precedes all of the destruction. Because this bumping up and down motion causes the water to start doing this, oscillating up and down into transverse waves. However, it loses that momentum when it hits the crest and then slides back in. And this is exactly how lightning bolts work in the air. Because if you think about the atmosphere of the Earth having electric charge that's been distributed to it from the sun, a plasma that shoots out plasma at the planets. And the planets are themselves a torsion field consisting of mostly electric plasma. And the Earth and all the other planets with an atmosphere collect this electric charge at its surface before it's able to find a circuit to transfer that electric charge either through the poles of the planet or by having aligned magnetic currents and a fractal environment of these magnetic currents in which the monopoles of the different elements allow a direct path for charge to meet in the center of where that lightning bolt is, twist, and expand out into the environment. The evidence of this comes from the fact that we can hear thunder. Because sound waves, as we already know, propagate in packet-like motions, pressure. And this pressure from thunder is caused by the colliding of two different currents meeting in the center of lightning. Now, keep in mind lightning, because now we're going to look at what we call the spark gap. And this spark gap is a fancy way of saying there's a deficit of electric current or voltage on one side of a conductor as opposed to the other side that has an excess. And when the electrical fields propagate enough that they're able to meet, the lightning bolt happens. This is an exchange of information between different points. Now, extrapolating on that a little bit more, if we look at the human brain and understand that we have two hemispheres in our brain, and that in between the two hemispheres at the top is a gap before meeting the top of our spinal column, we begin to see some analogies here, suggesting that our brains are both interacting with and creating both these longitudinal waves that are very similar to lightning and how it creates thunder in the atmosphere. In electrical engineering, we call this a difference in the voltage potential, and it's described as a sort of electrical pressure that builds until it can find an outlet to dump that pressure. Again, returning to the analogy of water, just like how water flows down a river because it's trying to reach equilibrium at the end of the waterfall as the water falls off the cliff, electric charge moves downhill or towards where there's a deficit of electric charge or a magnetic sink in which all the electric charge can find equilibrium or harmony to get pushed back into the collective field, just like water waves reaching a seashore. To kind of display how this is possible and what it means, if we look at the double slit experiment, which was an experiment to see how waves propagate through two slits when arriving at the back wall, they found that when there was nothing to observe the waves as they moved, the waves propagate in a distribution pattern, which are all of the ways that you could potentially have had the waves hit the back wall if there weren't walls in front of it. However, when they added an observer or a camera just to watch the interaction, what's happening is that as the waves interact with the wall, a created geometry through consciousness, the waves have to then find their way back into the conscious reality that we're perceiving. Why is this? Because human beings exist within a narrow range of frequencies, from about 1 hertz to around 700 hertz, or 300 megahertz if you want to include the heat that we put off. And this is kind of where we return to the idea of what we can see, because it turns out that in a conscious universe, between an observer and the observer is driving the show, depending on how much grip they have on their reality. How is this possible? Because if we understand that within a plasma is a variety of different frequencies, and the more advanced and powerful a plasma is, the more it can create and maintain different sets of frequencies. And being a plasma ourselves, as we just talked about with the brain, and in later episodes we'll explore further by examining how chakras feed into these vortex-like systems, we begin to see that by existing within our set of frequencies, anything that we create exists in that frame of reference. And that frame of reference causes the waves and the walls to interact once again. I know this might be a little hard to understand, but really the easiest way to understand this is that everything is happening all at once. It takes the conscious observer and their expectations to begin to do what physicists call collapse the waveform, or collapse the wave function. We can begin to understand that the walls existed but weren't in the frame of reference of the paper on the back wall of the double slit experiment. And so, because the paper wasn't trying to observe the walls didn't exist. The same thing exists with us and what we can't see or hear. Now, getting back to the observed and the observer, just because we're not aware of these things around us doesn't mean we're not being observed, and doesn't mean we're not being interacted with. How many times have you had thoughts that came out of nowhere? Or how many times have you seen flickers in the corner of your eyes or flashes of light out of nowhere? How many times have you heard voices that you just don't know where they're coming from? What if I said that because plasma can be in different frequencies and contain different energy states, scientists have stated that they have two different modes. One is called dark mode, where we can't see it and it's not within the visible light spectrum. And the other is glow mode, a high energy state where plasma is burning off a ton of energy and within these extremely high frequencies that our eyeballs see in the terahertz range. To give you a perspective of how absurdly high our eyes see, when we go into a dark room, we can't even see ourselves. Without an external light source that's putting off these insanely high frequency electromagnetic waves, we can't see anything. However, all energy has an inherent glow, which comes from this process of implosion. Because these glows happen as energy changes the different shells within an electron. So with that in mind, if we understand that electrical entities or plasmas can be torsion fields contained within a torsion field like the Earth, just like we can, I don't think it's crazy to say that all of these different creatures and entities that have been talked about for hundreds and thousands of years, such as gnomes, fairies, leprechauns, ghosts, aliens, spirits, angels, all of these beings are just self-contained energetic patterns or electrical toruses that are not operating within our visual spectrum or our auditory hearing range. But one thing is for sure, that as human beings become more understanding of how energy itself can be electrically intelligent, we need to begin to understand that we're surrounded by consciousness. And that while we feel like we're alone on this planet and the other animals don't get what we're doing, we're surrounded by unbelievable amounts of entities that know exactly what we're doing, can read our minds, and are directing us in ways that would either benefit us or possibly harm us. I think that's actually a great topic for another episode, where we look at how what we would call a negative entity might interact with a being that is unbelievably unaware of its environment, to the degree that it would do things like poison itself and assume that this has to be the only life, while there are thousands of things staring at it every second. One assumes. They talk about these different beings in different texts, like the Urantia book. They're called midway creatures. Or in Christianity, they're often called demons or angels. These beings, entities, can be of varying complexity and intelligence. And obviously, the longer they've been around and the energetic field that they split off from directly determines the amount of control they have over their environment, our environment, and the interaction of us. Because actually, if you begin to look at angels or archangels in the way they're described in various texts, it suggests that human beings actually live within the archangels. Which means that when you're praying, you're not praying to something outside yourself. You're praying to the field that you're directly connected to. And it's using you as an anchor point to get information about the total system. Because it's just an embedded consciousness stacked on top of your consciousness. Meaning that both Archangel Michael and you can interact with each other at will. And I believe that's where human beings are going. Understanding that the rock in front of us is only a rock right now, because we want it to be a rock, and it wants to be a rock, and the earth wants it to be a rock. Without any of those things, it's just consciousness, or prima materia, or the ether, or what science calls phase conjugated waveforms, creating an encapsulated energy pattern that's self-sustaining. And honestly, I feel like analyzing this a little bit further and tying it into some physics might actually lead us to a unified field theory. But that's something I'm working on, and let's not get ahead of ourselves. So with that said, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. My name's Adam David, and if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment or write me an email at adam@adamweichel.com. And I'd like to also say that I've started recently offering esoteric astrology readings, because I've found that esoteric astrology is the only astrology that takes into account the Earth as a major placement in one's chart. And it also takes into account the ascendant as being the most important aspect of a chart, because if you look at the universe, again, as a series of embedded plasma toruses, and understand that the ascendant in astrology is the eastern horizon of the Earth when you're born, I believe that the ascendant is a great way to understand the soul's intention in this life, because it's the direction that the energy is moving along with the Earth. Because let's not forget, when you take your first breath on the Earth, you're moving from being contained inside of your mother and taking in her information to breathing in the information that's being influenced by all of the planets, the stars, the sun, all of it. Your first breath is your setting energy pattern on your incarnation. And it's from that point forward that you begin transmuting energies and changing them internally, just like a plasma torus, for yourself. And you become an individual fractal of God. And with that in mind, I've been able to use esoteric astrology to accelerate my path through understanding my spiritual connection to the universe and figuring out what I excel at and what my soul really wanted to do in this lifetime. So I've started to offer esoteric astrology readings. This will get you a nice lengthy report along with a 60-minute consultation over Zoom or pre-recorded if you'd like, in which I'll go over the themes and general advice of your chart. I've gotten great reviews on these, and I'd love to help you out with this. So if you're interested, please leave a comment or write me at my email, adam@adamweichel.com. Thank you.